Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV WORLD. In today's show, we are going to be talking about two very important stories with reference to what is going on in India and Russia. We know that these are, of course, where the eyes of the world are at, and we are here to discuss what different angles these stories bring to you. What is happening in India, of course, is something that we've discussed over and over again, and it's very clear what the Modi regime has been doing with regards to its minorities and the way it's treating the Muslims of India in particular. We've known now that the Modi regime is, of course, accomplice in all of what is going on in India. It's also putting forward a mindset and an ideology that encourages violence against these minorities, so much so that there are reports of India moving towards a genocide. We also know that recently there was an anti-Muslim post by BJP's Gujarat chapter, which has now been taken down by the social media sites, but it was up there for quite a while, which depicted a couple of Muslim men being hanged. In the background, you can also see the three colors of the Indian flag, and also a reference to the Ahmedabad blast, depicting, of course, that the people who were responsible were Muslims, and their Muslims are terrorists, and that the conclusion is what they want to draw with that particular cartoon that was put forth. This, of course, has been met with a lot of backlash. A lot of users have complained against it, which is why it has now been taken down. But of course, points towards the fact as to what really is being taught in terms of the Modi regime, what it's advocating, what it's speaking about, and bringing forth to the different communities within India as well. We now will, of course, be also looking at the way that different parties have also responded to this. Congress party has also spoken about how terrorism has no religion, but whether or not in the larger run, how are we going to see the future of India in terms of whether or not there is an escape from this Hindutva ideology, what the BJP regime has brought in within India, and really what needs to be done about it and how to solve that. This is going to be our first segment of the show. In our second segment, we'll be taking a look at the Ukrainian crisis. In the developing situation, we've seen that in a recent announcement, Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden have agreed in principle to talk over what is going on. However, since there is no discussion on when this is going to happen, how it's going to happen, this is basically something just that has been agreed in principle, and perhaps has no real value at the moment. If there can be something substantial coming out of it, and how that will be so is something we'll explore further in detail, and then also try to analyze and think how the situation is currently escalating and what kind of a situation can there be and that needs to be avoided for this crisis not to escalate. This is going to be our second segment for the show. As you can see, I have been joined by Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal as usual in the debate, and we will also be joined online by our respected guests in the show. Before we move on to the discussion around what is going on, of course, within India and the way that we've seen the country move towards this deteriorating situation, we also know that a lot of people, a lot of well-known and well-respected people have spoken against what is going on in India, both within and outside of India, and talked about how the situation is something which is worrisome. World-renowned scholar Noam Chomsky has also spoken about it, and we're going to see what exactly he had to say with regards to Islamophobia, and how the current situation within India is something that is of concern to everyone. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
The pathology of Islamophobia is growing throughout the West. It's taking its most lethal form in India, where the Modi government is systematically dismantling Indian secular democracy and turning the country into a Hindu ethnocracy with almost 250 million Muslims becoming a persecuted minority. The assault is taking other forms as well. The pathology.
Well, this is what you heard coming in from Noam Chomsky, and this, of course, points towards the fact that there is so much that is of concern, and it is quite visible to people who are able to see objectively as to what is going on. But this, of course, needs to be something that has to be highlighted again and again, and perhaps spoken about more and brought into light to the people who still are ignoring this fact. Farrukh, Chomsky says something which is Hindu ethnocracy. What exactly does that mean?
Well, basically, the idea of believing in an identity or nationalism is basically here, and that is what they have been sharpening. Hindutva or Hindutva the word is Hindu-ness, right? And then these people actually want to develop this construct that Hindu-ness is some identity that is against Muslimism and other identities, and that is used or honed to be a weapon against Muslims and other minorities in India. But that is one aspect. Remember at this moment what is happening. Have you seen, I hope they can bring back the picture that was earlier shown, the cartoon, because there is some dog whistles there, right? Apparently it is about terrorism, but what do? They use the appearance of a common low class or a poor class Muslim to identify with this, right? You can see this. All pictures exactly the same.
Right.
What is the message? None of these terrorists must be having this kind of appearance. But this is a call against Muslims, right? What is happening? Why is it happening now? It is happening now because in UP, in 3 phases, BJP performed so poorly that yesterday Modi had to appeal to the people that don't eat, first go and ask other people and convey my message to other people, right? They are losing. That's why they have decided that they cannot actually. And this is the great part of realpolitik. Usually it is thought that you divide and rule. And this is a government that managed to unite all the disparate groups in India, from the Dalits who think that they are being treated shabbily, to Brahmins who think that there were enforced disappearances and fake encounters to kill them, 200 of them, right? At this moment, nobody is ready to vote for BJP. That's why now they are asking for Hindu-ness rather than any ethnic card or any caste card.
Right. But do you think that the Modi regime actually realizes the repercussions of such dangerous actions? Because of course, okay, there's one thing to gain votes, right?
Why would
but then this is just outright encouraging violence.
Yeah, so this is what they actually play on. What happened in 1990s? What happened in Gujarat? They allow the minorities to be butchered in plain sight, and then they actually bank on that sentiment of majoritarianism, and that has been happening. That's why the world has been talking about genocide and possibility of genocide.
Sana, if I could add into the same question, you know, right now, of course, we know that whatever India is doing in the context of, you know, being the front line, as we always say, against China for the Western countries, of course, they know that nobody would be, you know, blowing any whistles about it when it comes to the state level. So they have the ease of business. Whatever they want to do, they are doing it. And of course, when these kind of you know, cartoon pictures or you know, when we see these sort of things, of course, it reminds us of the previous century when Nazis did the same with the Jews in Germany. So this is what happened at that time, and now it is happening in India against Muslims from the Hindutva ideology, and world is quiet about it for certain reasons. Number one being the front line, number two being the huge market for their products and for their multinationals, and this is what is you know, just playing.
Right, allow me to just counter this argument. I think that whenever we bring up the idea of a front line, we are helping India's propaganda. Why? Because at this moment, the world order is not fixed. Everything is keeps on changing. At that time, it is important to remember that Indian moles all over the world were planted 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and they keep on bringing up the idea of China being their red peril. Right, and in front of that, India is going to be the sacrificial animal or something like that. But with due respect, it is not fixed. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, India managed to export its pundits to all think tanks all over the world, and they have been working on hardening the identities based on clash of civilizations, because that actually benefits them, right? The other side of the coin, or this other argument regarding, you know, marketplace, again, China is bigger market than India, right? And all of the world wants to actually trade with India, China as well. So remember, the case is not lost. At this moment, what they are doing, again, this picture also shows you something very interesting. Then, if you remember the Karnataka, you know, headscarf and all that hijab debate, has been actually somehow managed in a way that it is going to create more problems. For example, when you asked me the other day about hijab, I said that it is about rights of women to control their bodies, right? Nobody has the right to tell them what to wear, what not to. And what is happening now, gradually there is a shift, and I believe that they control both sides. On the other side, especially the religious clergy, is calling it a matter of identity.
Right.
What does this do? It actually fixes everyone into this hardening of identity that can be later used as a clash of civilizations. right?
Absolutely.
So this is how they play.
And this
We
is the
don't have to
divide they
play
want to
that
build
way.
on. Yes,
Sana,
Faisal.
just one thing I wanted to disagree with.
Thank you. Finally, you are disagreeing with me, right?
Yeah, about China, why it's not a big market for the Westerners? Because China is self-contained when it comes to their own domestic production, and they rely on their own domestic production, and they are tending towards export more and import less. So that's why, I mean, trading with them.
All right, but regardless of
that.
that, what is
Okay,
going
I
on?
have a counter for this as well. I'm sorry.
Sure, you
go
can
ahead.
add to that.
You
But
go ahead.
regardless to that, of course, what is going on within India also points to a larger problem when we see such posts coming on social media. Apparently, there are checks and balances, there is accountability, there are reasons of not posting certain material. There's so much hue and cry about hate speech and all of that. But yet again, we needed lots and lots of complaints before this was put down. Don't you think that we also need to be focusing on the way that perhaps general bodies or social media sites or impartial bodies are actually there to act in accordance with what is right and wrong, or are they also part of the game?
Right, and now you have just lifted the lid of the Pandora's box. It is a big debate, a huge debate
Go ahead.
in the West, and we are going to talk about that as well. But first of all, allow me to just present the counter that I had regarding China. China under President Xi Jinping has been opening up for imports, and I think that even at this moment, from Hollywood to everything, people are accusing their own elites that because they are trading with China, they are not harsh on China, right? I think that China has a lot of capacity to trade with the world. China has always seen itself as the middle kingdom, and all the rest of the world as a tributary. It doesn't want to colonize anyone. It wants to ensure that inputs are there, right? And that's why all this PRI. Regardless, now your question, if you notice this picture, this cartoon was posted on two platforms. One, Twitter, which actually responded to complaints and took it down. Twitter did, BJP did not, right? This is the official handle. The other one is Facebook. Facebook did not. Until I came here, I didn't see that there was any change. Why? You have seen the so-called Facebook leaks that were presented only a couple of months ago to the US Congress, and there you see how much manipulation by the Indian side and honing of what earlier Raja Saab was saying, they manipulate. But I tell you, the biggest problem is not that. They are actually harvesting. Facebook is harvesting data from India to train their artificial intelligence. And how they are doing it, they actually turned WhatsApp into this fintech capacity. They are saying that they are going to anonymize all the data, but they are not. They are harvesting data. That's why they are going to placate India, because India is their lab rat. In that situation, this will happen. But regarding control, the question at this moment is who is going to actually police the social media, whether they are going to be the social media companies or the countries. Because of certain clauses in the US law, we are not allowed to actually challenge them in a court. But then there is this debate that they have to water down that so that you can take them to the courts.
And but this is such a dark, chaotic place. And it seems that it's such a hard, not only in India, of course.
Because of India, but all over the world. It is Indian trolls who are actually totally bulldozing the entire world. You can see it.
Sadly, Sana, the problem is, in today's world, what we're seeing is that all of these, social media apps, they are being used as a bargain chip by the West especially when it comes to, like, foreign policy and all of these, or we'll be extending help to you to build up your narratives and support your narratives rather than supporting your foe's narrative. And this is actually taking place, and the probes are being done, and the systematic, as Farrukh mentioned, there is a systematic way of doing that, and artificial intelligence, obviously it's playing a huge role in it. And the way Indian artificial intelligence experts and IT experts and experts of emerging technologies, they were given a waiver to penetrate in these fields. The only reason was that they obviously had to create a sort of influence on the social mediums, and they have gained it. And in today's world, of course, all of these social mediums, they are being utilized as a lobby as well. So the lobbying is being done.
I'm assuming you're
shaking my
disagreeing.
head
Yes.
vociferously. I think that whatever the reason Indian technocrats are there in the Silicon Valley, there must be small companies where they are, and they might be manipulating. But at this moment, there is a change in Twitter. Agarwal actually took over, and there are others as well. And I think that I am grateful that there are people from of Indian origin there, because the pain becomes their personal one, right? They know what is being lost in India, and that's why you have seen that Twitter has not compromised. By the way, during the Jack Dorsey's time, there was an attack on their office. Police was sent to the office. Luckily, at that time, people were being asked to stay at home because of social distancing, and that's when no harm came. But they kept on pressing them. Again, if you look at how Facebook India has been behaving, there's been a lot of pressure, and there are great examples of people who stood up to this authoritarianism. Look, whether you like it or not, Indian diaspora is there, and it is very successful. You have to work with that, right? But the fact is that they are no longer Indians. They have given up their Indian passports, and they are either the US citizens, they are European citizens, or elsewhere. Identity doesn't matter. Origin doesn't matter. What does matter? It matters that they are either good people or they are fascists, proto-fascists. If there is a proto-fascist, I mean, I can give you one example. Facebook itself, its owner, right? The two people who are actually controlling are themselves proto-fascists. And they have been wreaking havoc with everything, right?
Right.
Similarly, Elon Musk, people like them, right? Again and again, you see them throwing their weight behind such causes, which are wrong. So you have to actually tell people apart rather than by their identity or origin.
And perhaps this is something that the Modi regime would disagree with, and in terms of what they're doing and manipulating the people in India and otherwise as well. Let's take a look at what the Singaporean Prime Minister said a couple of days ago with regards to the situation in India.
Nehru's India has become one where, according to media reports, almost half the MPs in the Lok Sabha have criminal charges pending against them, including charges of rape and murder. Though it is also said that many of these allegations are politically motivated.
Again, I said this the previous time we heard this as well, and this time around as well. I understand that this is something of grave concern, and what the Singaporean Prime Minister was speaking is, of course, pointing towards the state of affairs. But then he also speaks about how perhaps most of these charges are politically motivated. Does that not take away from the responsibility that lies with the Indian regime, Faisal?
Of course it does, and he rightly pointed out, and previously I mentioned it as well. To me, obviously, the whole parliament is of that nature, because they kept quiet on all of these things. I mean, atrocities are being made around them, and nobody's talking anything about it, and nobody's doing nothing about it. We keep on highlighting a fact that the secular India that started as a secular India is no more a secular India. And today's India is the one. I mean, previously we've been hearing that Muslim female students, they won't be allowed to get in the schools, and the teachers, Muslim teachers, won't be allowed. By the way, one of the teachers, science teachers of a school, when she was not allowed to enter in her hijab in a school, she simply put a resignation through, rather than going to a school to teach her students. She said, if nobody is allowing me to enter
I don't know
in,
if everyone can afford that. You know,
yeah.
these are choices
And
that perhaps
now-
not everyone will be willing
now,
to make.
Now today's news is, as we earlier mentioned, that time is not far that even the Sikhs would be told to remove their turbans. Not the turbans this time, but they have
Kirpan.
asked them to leave your kirpan at home when you are coming to vote. So one by one, things are heading towards obviously the same side where Hindutva would be
right. And again, the
Hindustan.
kirpan is important because it's part of their identity, Farrukh. So when we're speaking about identity, isn't this something also very inherent to an individual and who they are? And again, I understand the good in people and what's important in that sense. But even when we were talking about all the different ways that we allow people to express themselves and practice around their lives freely, then identity also becomes a huge part in that, no?
Right, and that is a problem. I have no doubt that people who go after these people or these disparate groups are actually going after their identity, and they want to actually destroy their identity. I have no doubt about that. But here's the problem. Remember, luckily today we had more time to talk. But usually with programs like these, you have to present an elevator version of some arguments. So you don't get to deconstruct the whole thing, right? There are nuances. For example, kirpan is a sharp object, right? And carrying it can actually imply that this is going to actually, it can potentially hurt someone. But here's the problem. Why did you allow it for past 70 years, right? Even when in 1947 there was violence, they were only asked to sheath their kirpans, not to actually leave them at home. So there is something very intriguing going on. My problem is that this is the era where everything has somehow become identity, and then that identity is militarized to be used against the very people who were being supposed to be protected, right? I'm not a great fan of identity politics. When I see a human being, I don't see their appearance, their color, right, their gender. I see a human being, and I love that I can communicate with everybody. So that is my ideal of the world. But with due respect, this problem has actually been exported to the West as well. If you see everywhere, when you read all these reports or investigations that have come to public, you feel that something is missing. Something has been scrubbed out of the picture, photoshopped out of it. And what is that? India, right? Indian people have been contributing to QAnon, to far-right identities like alt news and alt-right, and they have been totally ignored. That means India has some power that is hidden. I believe that because of theosophic identities in 1947 and before, India has a connection with secret societies all over the world, and through that they are robbing the West, and they manage to steal them of their identity and their democracy.
Right, and then I think another thing with identity is like it's like a jack in the box. Even the identities you're trying to suppress will perhaps identify more with their identities and will sort of be like a self-fulfilling prophecy, which will just create more clashes. And that in itself is such a vicious thing to happen and to manipulate. Yes, Faisal, you added something.
Sana, I just wanted to highlight here that I think when it comes to democracy or the practices which should be followed when you have democracy in your country, then Britain is an excellent example. I still remember that I went through a case of initially, Sikh policemen, they were not allowed to wear turbans. And obviously they had to wear the uniform but not the turbans. But later on, of course, the UK, it allowed, the courts of UK, they allowed that if somebody wants to serve the police services, they can by all means wearing their turbans, and their turbans should not be stopping them to serve this country in the police. So I think these are, and same goes out for the hijab as well. I have came across so many police officers in Britain who are wearing hijab, and serving their
Right.
nation in there. So these are the brilliant examples
Right.
which
It's
should be
honestly not
followed.
that complicated anyway. It's quite simple if you're able to give space and make space for people of
Yeah.
all kinds to be there. It really is not that complicated. And unless someone is getting harmed, you allow them to move about their lives freely. But whatever happens in India is, of course, questionable at the moment as well, and we hope things change in the future. But one thing's for sure, the power of the people, and the more and more people who advocate strongly and talk about and express and have their voice registered will make a difference. Like the post that we saw today, if there were not any users, perhaps it would still be on. Perhaps it would be nobody who's even talking about this issue at the moment. But because there are so many people who talked about this, there is change. And perhaps that is true for any sort of change that's taken place in history. We'll move on to our next segment with reference to what is going on in Ukraine. We know that the situation has been completely different at one day and the other, and we see that we've gotten different responses from Russia, the United States, and NATO, and there's so much that is still debatable as to how things will evolve in the coming days. Just for now, we know that Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin have, in principle, agreed for a summit. This, of course, has no timeline at the moment, has no framework, so this is yet to be seen whether or not it will actually take place, and even if it does, what sort of tangible results will it have to offer. But for the moment, there is an escalating situation going on at the Ukrainian border, and we see now that increasingly people are getting more worried about what is going to happen and take place, even though Russia has repeatedly spoken about how it has no plans to invade Ukraine, even though the troop buildup speaks otherwise. Farrukh, what we've seen today in terms of the announcement made with Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, it gives us some sort of hope that perhaps the situation can be handled without escalation or a lot of damage. But given what has been happening in the past couple of weeks and months, we've seen that such measures have not really been fruitful. Do you have any hope?
Right. Hope has appeared, and I think it appeared in the shape of a man called Macron, President Macron, who actually interceded on both sides and actually brought them together. See, at this moment, I had this strange feeling that there are forces that keep on egging all the sides to some kind of conflict. And for example, in Western case, it is clear, it is Western media. You saw what happened with Afghanistan, the way they destroyed the reputation of Biden administration, right? And one can not help but think that there is a lobby behind it that was heard because of the way everything actually was mellowed down. Then on the other side, when you look at President Putin, he is being pushed by certain quarters as well, and then what is happening on the grassroots level, right, in the disputed areas. There too, people are being asked or forced or compelled or encouraged to go to violence. So at this moment, there are many loose bodies, but I'm glad that finally diplomacy is catching on. If this meeting takes place, I will have greater hope than I have today.
All right, that's good to know. Professor Scott Lucas, who's a political analyst, has also joined us on Skype. Thank you very much, Scott, for being with us in the debate. We're, of course, talking about what is going on in terms of the Ukrainian crisis and the recent announcement that has been made that Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin have agreed in principle for a summit. And we're just discussing whether or not we can put our hopes in this summit and see a positive change coming out of it. What do you think?
I so wish I could join you in those hopes, but they have already been overtaken by what has happened in Moscow in the last few hours. First, the Kremlin said there are no plans for Biden to speak soon with Vladimir Putin, or rather Vladimir Putin to speak with Joe Biden. And then that was followed by an extraordinary staged event where Vladimir Putin raised the stakes. In the guise of getting each of his cabinet officials and his top military people to give their thoughts, in effect reading off a script, he did two things. The first is he repeated a series of insults and falsehoods about Ukraine up to the point that Ukraine is carrying out a genocide against Russian speakers inside the country. Not true. That Ukraine armed forces had crossed the Russian border overnight. Not true. And that the Ukrainians were shelling separatist forces. Not true. Beyond those specific, as it were, pretexts for possible Russian military action, He then got to the specifics. He set up the likelihood that later today he will recognize the separatist Russian-backed areas of Donetsk and Lugansk as, quote, independent. In other words, he will be sanctioning the breakup of Ukraine, and that, in effect, is an act of war. Because once those so-called republics become independent, then Russia can move armed forces onto their territory at the supposed invitation of the leaders of those breakaway areas.
Right. But Dr. Lucas, that means that this is the end of Minsk agreement?
It would be the end of the Minsk agreement. And we had been watching this carefully for several days because it was clearly a measure that Putin could take, but it would be one that effectively scrapped the diplomatic path that you have been talking about. Because the whole premise of the Minsk agreement is whether we were talking about autonomy for the Donbass region, which includes Donetsk and Lugansk, whether we were talking about some other arrangement, a federal arrangement under Kiev, it was not one where you would be splitting up the country. And as soon as Putin announces this in effect is, well, let me give you a historical parallel you might recall. Remember back in 1938 when the pressure of Nazi Germany split away Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia as a prelude to what eventually became World War II? That, in effect, is what has taken place in Eastern Europe, or could take place today, that Russia is splitting away part of Ukraine and then defying everybody else, the US, Europe, NATO, and of course Kiev.
This actually takes me back to a couple of briefings from the Biden administration. One regarding the false flag operations, and the second one regarding the possible the fact that the war is now, or invasion is now imminent. Don't you think that all of this in the international media is going to validate that point, and it works against President Putin, and he has to realize that it is going to actually frame him as the as the main villain in the story?
That's a great question. I think first specifically on the false flags, you know, it's not just the U.S. It's the U.S., Europeans, Australia, and who have revealed, that they had intelligence that there was going to be this pretext, and we saw it in the past week. You know, we saw the attempt to set up Russian military action with the idea that there was shelling of a kindergarten in eastern Ukraine. That shelling was not done by Ukrainian forces. Then we saw it when the Jeep belonging to the leader of the pro-Russian militia in eastern Ukraine was blown up, again, a staged event. Because the false flags didn't bring about the pretext for the invasion, then Putin crosses a line, and it's a critical line that you've mentioned. It's easier for the Russians to put out the line, which is we're only responding because NATO might go into Ukraine, or Ukraine might become a part of NATO, or because there are Western defensive weapons or weapons going to Ukraine. It's much tougher for Putin to spin this by saying, I'm defending Moscow by recognizing the breakup of Ukraine. He has crossed a political line. And I think, therefore, it sort of doubles down on his gamble. His initial gamble was not working.
What exactly do you think will be the repercussions for crossing this political line? Of course, we've seen that there's so many talks about from the US side saying that this is going to happen, or that is going to happen, or this is what Russia is going to face in terms of serious consequences of a military action. But this, of course, as you were mentioning, is also an act of war. So what can we expect from the US side?
Well, I think the immediate question, again, not just for the US, because I have to emphasize this isn't the US versus Russia. You've got Europeans involved, you've got NATO involved, is whether the sanctions are now ratcheted up now. In other words, rather than waiting for a Russian cross-border military operation, or heaven help us, Russian bombing, you step up the sanctions at this point to say it is unacceptable for Putin to take this move to recognize parts of Ukraine as being independent, breaking up the country. You cannot wait on the sanctions anymore. That will be, I think, what is being considered right now. In fact, I think it's been considered in the last few days, because you may remember that at the Munich Security Conference, the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, despite the crisis, he went to Munich and he made the appeal to the countries that were gathered specifically to say, you need to put in the sanctions now. You cannot wait. And I think that was in anticipation that this type of move might take place. So that's the immediate thing I'll be watching over the next 24 hours.
Yeah, Professor Scott, a question for you. You know, if we look at the historic events, not very far historic events, the recent ones, if we talk about South Sudan, of course, there was a clear divide, and America took a side, and that side was South Sudan. And if we talk about the East Timor, America took a side against Indonesia, and that was East Timor. And here we have a situation in eastern Ukraine where majority of the people, I mean, it is said that 80 to 85% of the population is ethnically Russian. And if they want to break away, why are we seeing that this time America is not standing with them, rather is standing on the other side? What is so different here?
First of all, on the specific Ukrainian point, there are a lot of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. But just because you're Russian speaking, just because you have Russian cultural ties, does not mean that you want to join Russia. It does not mean that you want to leave Ukraine. To take the parallel case of Crimea, in Crimea, before 2014, when Russia occupied the country, there was never a majority in Crimea that wanted to join Russia, despite the fact that there are a lot of Russian speakers there. So I think we've got to be a bit more nuanced about the idea that while there are cultural links, there are links of language between the two countries, that doesn't mean that Ukrainians want to jump across and become Russians. On your other point, which is an excellent point, the difference between the South Sudan and the East Timor cases were that they didn't occur under the force of arms. We can debate whether South Sudan should have been split away from Sudan. We can debate whether the international community...
You ask a question, then I have to. Please go ahead.
Right, Scott, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what you were mentioning earlier in terms of sanctions, not waiting for the sanctions, and that the time is, of course, to be able to go ahead with it now in terms of what is going on. But at this point, do you really think that if we go ahead and see these sanctions taking place, will they have a deterrent impact? Will they be able to be used as a preventative measure in terms of an invasion?
We don't know if they will deter Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin, as he has shown today, as I think he has shown for months, is someone who is beyond, let's call it logical analysis, given how much he has invested in this as a personal mission. But I put it to you that you have to take a step in response.
I don't know whether it is counterproductive or not. You're saying something, Dr. Lucas?
Yeah, I'm saying that if you do not take a step in response to Putin's recognition of these breakaway areas or supposedly breakaway areas, in effect, he has gotten away with it without saying whether or not it's right or wrong.
Dr. Lucas, let me come back to the question that was raised earlier by Raja Faisal and qualify it. Not only Darfur or other Sudan or for that matter, other parts of the world, East Timor, but even in Bosnia, the US actually took a stance. The question at this moment is force will always be there like it was in Balkans. But there usually are some UN-led measures to judge whether there is public support for an idea, for example, plebiscites, for example, referendums. Is there a possibility to actually reconcile this issue by actually going through the UN and finding a solution there? This is one aspect. But then there are two loose cannons that I look at. One is, of course, Donbass region and how these breakaway republics or identities are fighting or using force. And there is a chance that they might be actually exploited by a third party. It can be any party. And then President Zelensky's this statement at Munich conference, you just pointed out, that he said the time for sanctions is now, but he also talked about fast-tracking and the need for fast-tracking Ukraine's request to join NATO. Do you think that that might have also actually accelerated the anger in the system?
To take that question first, no, I think, because the Russians know that NATO membership is not on the card for Ukraine. It hasn't been on the cards for Ukraine. It's something to which the Ukrainians aspire, including in their 2019 constitution. But NATO has been very careful and the member states have been very careful not to extend membership because of the internal issues in Ukraine that we're talking about, as well as the effect on Russia. So that's sort of a pretext for the Russians to take action. In terms of what you talk about, which is, all right, could we have a plebiscite? Could the UN get involved? That takes us back to where you were before we started our conversation, which is we thought with Emmanuel Macron in Moscow, there might be a diplomatic off-ramp, right? Let's get, okay, Biden speaks to Putin, but then you get an agreement that you have discussions through the Organizations for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Then you have perhaps a revival of the Normandy format, France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. And we talk about the strategic framework for all of Eastern Europe, not just Ukraine. That's that diplomatic off-ramp that the West has been holding out to Putin for months, and he will not take it.
Yeah. Professor Scott, I just wanted to ask if we have a situation in coming days where, of course, this eastern Ukraine side, obviously Donetsk and Donbass areas, they are either declared as independent, if not joined with Russia. And if we have this kind of situation, what kind of impact it would have on NATO and the rest of the Europe and its relation with the US?
This is a test case not for NATO in terms of let's have a World War III with Russia. This is not even a test case for NATO and its member states of let's have a new Cold War with Russia. This is something very specific and different, which has been accelerated by Putin. And that is, do you have an international order of rules that recognizes the sovereignty of states, or can those rules be changed? I say this with the memory of what happened in Iraq in 2003. Because that was a case where the international order was weakened, if not broken, by what the United States did. Now, almost 20 years, you've got Vladimir Putin gambling. My country might be weak economically. I might have significant opposition within my country. But
Dr. Lucas, I'm so glad that you brought up Cold War and the prospects of a third world war, and then role of NATO as well. Because when we were taught IR and various strategic issues, we were taught that there's a balance of terror and mutual assured destruction and ideas like that that ensured that there wasn't a World War III during the Cold War because both sides had nukes. At this moment, it seems that something has changed in the argument. And despite the fact that France is a nuclear capable country, your country is also a nuclear capable country, and Russia, of course, has the nukes as well. At that time, I don't get two things. One, the hurry. What is pushing President Putin towards such a kind of confrontational path? And the second one is that regardless of it, why is it that balance of terror or mutual assured destruction is not applicable right now?
I mean, the mutually assured destruction, I think, went out the window decades ago, because at the end of the day, you have to be willing to launch nuclear weapons to deter somebody. And I don't think we ever want to get that far. Goodness knows, I hope we don't get that far in this case, which I think brings it back to, why is Putin doing this? And in fact, I'm about to go into a podcast to discuss this in a few minutes, so I've been thinking about it. Here is a man who has been leader of Russia for more than 20 years. He came in saying, we're going to restore Russian greatness. We have suffered because of the end of the Cold War. We suffered because of the 1990s. I'm going to make Russia great again economically, politically, militarily. Economically, it hasn't worked. Russia is not great economically. Politically, Russia, for various reasons, has not become part of that post-Cold War order, whether you blame that on the West or you blame it on Putin's own activities. Russia, in effect, has isolated itself. So how does he go out? How does he go out as an old man? Well, he fulfills his legacy by restoring a greater Russia. And how do you restore a greater Russia? Vladimir Putin does not believe Ukraine is a separate country. He said only a couple of weeks ago, he recited a very crude Russian poem I won't give you the exact lyrics, but in effect, Ukraine is dead and it should be raped. Ukraine should be part of greater Russia, is what Putin and those advisors you mentioned think. And that's why he's taking this gamble. So far, the gamble hasn't paid off. I mean, the fact is, the US, Europe, NATO did not step away from Ukraine. They did not give Putin that space. Now we have to see what happens because he's decided to put more chips
when you're calling
into
it
the
a
pot.
gamble, Dr. Lucas, that means that nobody can be certain what comes next. You were saying that there is a possibility that he is going to recognize. We don't know if it is just posturing or whether he is actually going to do it, right?
I watched the press conference. Up until this press conference, which was his purported National Security Council, I had exactly the same opinion you do. I do not know if he was going to recognize these areas of Ukraine as independent, which is what the Russian parliament said last week. But then what happened is that speaker after speaker, the military leaders, the defense secretary, Mr. Shoigu, the former president and prime minister, Mr. Medvedev, one after one said it is time to recognize these breakaway republics. And the Kremlin then announced that Putin will make his decision this evening. So in other words, they've leverage for the fact
But that is leverage, I know. That is leverage. Bolster your leader's hand and then say that whatever you want to do. And then he can say that, look, I'm walking away from this. Go ahead, Sana.
Right. Scott, you can respond to that.
Yeah, I think that is one way we could play it, which is, look, he's simply upping the stakes because he's simply trying to get leverage in a space where you try to get what? Well, you get some type of concessions. Again, NATO and the U.S. backing away from Ukraine, that you try to get autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk. And that would be possible except for the fact that Putin didn't say, I'm going to take 3 or 4 days to make this decision. He said, I'm doing it later in a couple of hours. The
Right.
timing of this doesn't, the timing of this is what's significant.
Right. Thank you so much, Scott Lucas, for being with us in the debate and talking to us in detail with regards to what's going on. And this, of course, changes the entire situation in the way that we've been looking at the Ukrainian crisis and, of course, how we will be able to see the situation in terms of how it's going to evolve. Because, of course, such an announcement or such a move means that the proposition of this situation actually reversing or going towards a more positive diplomatic gain seems bleaker and bleaker. But, of course, we'll see what happens in a couple of hours, and by tomorrow we'll be able to discuss this further. Thank you so much for joining us in the debate. We'll see you tomorrow at 9.